All right, we are recording. So this is the second group of um, Apache Cassandra Kubernetes operator SIG meetings that the last ones we had. There were two, one West Coast friendly and APAC, and then the other one's East Coast friendly and CEST friendly. I think mostly it was just gathering everyone's like, yes, this is what we want to do. Here's some basic outlines, and the guidance was let's go create a CEP. So uh, magic as it is, Ben and I have just put the finishing touches on it. I'm going to go ahead and put the link for CEP number 2 in the chat window. This is on the Cassandra C Wiki. Granted, this is pretty light as it sits, but I think Ben, do you want to walk through this? I mean, I'll give you a chance to. You can put some, or you want to share your screen, or how do you want to do this?
Yeah,
I
let
could share my
me
screen if you want.
on here. And I will share my screen in 1 second. And I'm going to just switch devices. Bear with me for 1 second.
Switch devices. I mean, I'm leaving now. Okay. Ben is back.
I am back. And I will share my window. All right, awesome. So let's, I won't revisit what a CEP is or what it isn't, but fundamentally it's here to just, drive discussion around major changes, right, that potentially impact a number of things that go beyond the scope of what a JIRA would. So me and Patrick, we've spent kind of last few days working on the CEP. And when I say the last few days working on the CEP, you'll be like, well, what the heck have you been doing? Because it's not particularly a lot of words, but there's been a lot of discussion that's kind of driven this. And what we wanted to do was purely establish our very high level thoughts on this, and then use this as a launching pad for everyone that kind of is invested in this process, to be able to say this piece, to be able to, kind of debate it, and to help drive the design kind of going forward. To give you a very quick overview, what I'll do is I'll run through this kind of step by step, and explain a little bit of our reasoning around why we included things, why we didn't. And, again, feel free to jump in and we can have the discussion then and there. And I might pause a little bit to kind of open it up. And of course, Patrick, please jump in and correct me if I get anything wildly incorrect. Motivation to make it easy to run Cassandra on Kubernetes. I think that's a pretty good, solid start that I think we could probably all agree on. We've all tackled this from various degrees of, Kubernetes is increasingly becoming a target that we need to run more and more of our capability on top of, whether that's on-prem, in the cloud, however you want to, skin that particular cat. We have a broader impetus within the organizations we're working on that, hey, Kubernetes is kind of what we've got to target here. And so what we've personally seen is, that's great for a lot of applications, but, dealing with stateful stuff is hard, mainly because Kubernetes as a community has ignored stateful capability for so long. It's always really easy to build distributed systems when you don't have to deal with state. But we're now at a point where it's starting to mature, and it makes sense to do this, and we've got that driving impetus. The audience that we've kind of targeted in terms of who will consume the operator, but also I believe who has input into this, it's pretty wide ranging, to be honest. The DevOps ops crowd, are going to have to shoulder a lot of this responsibility. But on the flip side, we tend to see this being consumed by developers that need to be able to test and run and build against, production environments or production-like environments, locally, and have stuff that kind of looks like it, right? So it is operator and consumer focused for sure. This is, not a project that is kind of in the weeds in the internals, and it is going to be a very consumer or end consumer of Cassandra focused. The goals that we have set for building out an operator, what we've done is we've kind of taken the operator maturity scale from the operator framework. It's something that's leveraged by Operator Hub as well to classify operators. Some of these different levels don't fit the exact kind of order of the way you would do things, particularly in a distributed system. But I think it's a useful framework to start to engage and think about how do we build something that is, sits also a little bit in that Kubernetes community as well as the Cassandra one. So we started off with the core goals of one, obviously lower the impedance between Kubernetes and Cassandra operations. That goes back to that core, that core motivation of making Cassandra easier to run on Kubernetes. But in terms of the first definition of what features, what should be in, what should we target first as the MVP, we've really driven that from the operator maturity scale. So we kind of talked about what do some operators do, what the existing operators do, and it kind of looks like a level 3 operator compliance makes sense for, I guess, what you'd call the MVP or the initial release of what we're trying to do here. What you will see, however, is clearly there is a mismatch between the operator maturity scale and how certain distributed systems should behave, right? So for example, level 5, they've classified horizontal and vertical scaling kind of in the same category as, a whole bunch of stuff that kind of sounds like AI ops to me, which is, it doesn't really make a ton of sense. So we've kind of chosen level 3 operator compliance as the target. So it can do full app lifecycle, storage lifecycle, so backup and recovery, as well as horizontal scaling. That makes the most sense with Apache Cassandra. We also identified providing a pathway to level 4. So it might not, the operator itself might not necessarily do this stuff out of the box, but it shouldn't prevent people who are using the operator from, plugging it into their metrics and alert and logging infrastructure that's already built around Kubernetes. And then one of the other goals was to have this listed on Operator Hub, which, it's kind of a nice end goal to plant a nice little flag in. So I'm going to pause there and just kind of open it up. And one, does using the operator maturity scale as a benchmark make sense? And, have we kind of picked the right levels to target, especially as a first cut, of this project?
Hey, this is Umair. I did have a quick question. So I agree with the target. I think level 3 plus, the scaling stuff makes a lot of sense. With regards to the operator SDK, do you see that as being the tool that's used to implement ultimately this operator, or are you trying to stay agnostic towards that?
For the purpose of the discussion, I'm sticking more to a lot of the questions around what and why rather than the hows. I think we will get into that pretty quickly. But, taking at least the operator maturity scale, it's very useful because it seems to have been a way in which the community starts to understand what operators can do, whether or not they've been implemented using the operator SDK or not. So that's kind of a bit of the rationale behind that thinking.
Yeah, fair enough.
So, yeah.
Yeah, cool.
This is David, or Decapwell. I had a question, at least from this the level perspective. It's with Cassandra itself, patch and manner upgrades and upgrades in general can be tricky to do correctly. And there are many cases in which we want to halt and be in mixed mode for whatever the duration is as we work things out. What are your thoughts on this and the capabilities there? And then the second one I was going to ask, it's since we're not doing like scaling up and scaling down, I'm assuming we're going to deal with like node replacements, which are also very tricky to get correct. And this kind of gets into repair itself. So what is the operator's relationship with the thingy doing the repair?
That's a really good question. I think, and this is where it kind of gets into more around implementation details and that kind of thing. I think if we as a community determine that in order for us, as the way that we see as people who have to run and operate Cassandra in production, if we feel internally that in order for us to tick off level 2 correctness, which is, patch and minor version upgrades are supported, and if we as a community believe that actually, sometimes this stuff is hard and we've got to hit the pause button and, go in and figure out what went wrong or roll it back or whatever. If that's a requirement for us to internally to meet what we consider to be level 2, well, then I think we got to tackle that for sure. So, I think this is more of a high level kind of set of asks. And it's up to us to kind of define what our version of done looks like for each of those. And then in terms of repair, that's a really good question. Repair is kind of interesting in that, like, it's something that needs to happen as a course or an action, or because of a result of stuff that happens from an operations perspective. But doing repair lifecycle management is also a big ask or a big task, right?
I might add
the
in
way
here,
that
though, Ben.
Sorry?
I think I just wanted to add something to this. David, you brought up some really specific things. Ben, I think adding to this goal thing is like, what does level 1, 2, and 3 mean in a Cassandra world?
Yeah.
And let's be specific. I mean, I think that's kind of the goal here. Is we don't want to get too general. We want to start. Yeah, these are the general guidelines from the operator SDK, but David, I think you have specifics. I'm sure other people will too. And like, where do you think things fit? Like, I could argue that repair fits in level 3. That's part of the life cycle.
And to piggyback on that, with even level 1, what just to zero in on configuration management, I think it'd be helpful to get more specific on that. For example, does that include encryption? What is the approach? Are we gonna for that? That's not certainly non-trivial.
Yeah, I would take that further, and I would say, what level of configuration do you want to support? Because as you guys have all seen a Cassandra YAML file, there's 100 different knobs that we can turn.
196 actually, but yeah. Not counting or anything. Well,
yeah.
I think this is great because we're getting into this. So the level 1, 2, 3 is what the operator SDK, like operator hub, asks, like, what can you do? But we have to provide our own answers. We could say, oh yeah, we do all 3 of these. Like, no one's going to go out and say, well, we looked and that's not the way you do lifecycle management, full lifecycle with Cassandra. Oh, we're busted. I think we have to decide on our own, and maybe there's things that we say, yeah, these are like the minimum for level 1, and then things to look forward to.
Yeah, I think one of the ways that'll help us define what these various levels look like for us. Well, when we get, it'll kind of become a little bit clearer as we get into some of the other sections. So for example, what are some of the non-goals, right? And just to jump forward for a second, one of the non-goals that, you know, me and Patrick kind of identified is actually, we don't want this to be like a serverless facade around Cassandra, right? So what does that mean, right? We don't want it to be so abstract where you just, you know, you define a Cassandra key space or you define a table and, you know, you just point it at the table and, you know, off you go, right? It'll still have concepts like clusters and nodes and that kind of thing. It is still a Cassandra cluster. And so I think as we progress the CEP and we talk about what do we want it to be, what do we not want it to be, it'll help us build some answers to what, you know, what does level 1 look like? What does level 2 look like? But also at the same time, some of this stuff won't actually, you know, be too clear until we get down and implement that, right? And I say that from experience in building our operator, right? We toss this backwards and forwards for a long time around how do we do configuration management? Like in the CRD, do we let people specify different configuration options, right? We got to a point where actually we decided to go completely the other way, which was, you know, we allow people to specify a Cassandra.yaml file, put it in a config map. We did some stuff around allowing you to specify, you know, YAML fragments that it can stitch together and do other bits and pieces there. I'm not saying that's the way to do it, but that's kind of where we landed on that side of the argument, right? But we only got to that part of the argument once we sat down to actually build it and figure out what it looked like. Hopefully we've all around this particular table got enough experience between us to have some stronger opinions before we get into the meat of it. But yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents on it. And I think having this document as a driving board, as a sounding board to drive that is a good thing. Cool. So am I with, oh,
well,
sorry, go ahead, man.
I was going to say, all good stuff. And everyone here can have access to this doc, full edit. This isn't Ben and Patrick gating information. Just real quick, the steps are, and I'll try to put this in a note too, is creating, when you go to the CWiki, you can create an account. And when you do, you can just let me or Ben know your username, and we can give you full edit rights, everything on this. And it has like a version tracking so that we know, you know, like what's happened or what's changed. There's also comments below too.
So, another comment going back to the configuration management, configuration options, and I think another example, I think, I guess where I may be driving at is wondering if just for the case of Cassandra or distributed systems, that I agree with the diagram, that I'm very familiar with it, but maybe it's overly simplistic. And I think it comes down to it's more than just, well, about how do we configure the YAML file. Like for example, yesterday I was doing some work for writing Ansible playbooks for automating using the even token distribution algorithm. So, and that's in 3.11, and that's awkward to say the least. And so, you know, there's a lot more involved there than just turning some knobs in the YAML file. It's a matter of executing, you know, some queries and I would say that's definitely a lot, you know, a higher level of configuration management than just setting some of the settings in the YAML, which I don't think would fall into level 1. And you know, I think you make the case that would be beyond that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and I think, you know, there will be a point around, you know, where when it comes to implementation details like that, of like, okay, let's support all the configuration options, but hey, this one has dependencies on others and that kind of thing. You know, I think a lot of it will just come down to, well, what do we want to support from day one? What are we happy with if you can do it, but it's awkward, but we've got a plan to improve that workflow? and then what do we just not support at the moment? We've got to figure out how to do that, right? We face a similar challenge with, implementing, SSL TLS between nodes, right? So how do you distribute certificates, right? The first cut of it was literally like, you can specify a key store, and if it's got everything in it, it might work. And then we started to work with like, well, how do we do certificate requests within Kubernetes and, all that kind of fun stuff. But I think there'll be a lot of these questions where the answer isn't black or white. It'll be like, well, here's the journey that we expect the operator to go on as we build out this capability. Cool. And that's the other reason I think why me and Patrick tried to stick to a lot of like why and what, because again, we didn't want to gate the conversation and be like, hey, this is the operator as envisaged by Ben and Patrick, because there's a lot of design decisions out there. So
and we're wrong often, I think, too. Yeah.
Sorry?
We're wrong often as well.
Oh, yeah. So the next stage, non-goal. So this is kind of some of the things that we thought maybe we don't want to try and attempt or tackle in this particular project. That's not to say they're not important questions or that they're not problems that the community should solve. It's just kind of like, maybe this isn't the best place to do it, right? So some of these are also pretty easy. So like one of the non-goals, which is like remove the need for any Cassandra administration, right? So I think from the start, trying to tackle that like level 5 self-healing, self-blah, is probably definitely a bit of a non-goal, at least for, the first good while. I think someone raised up like Cassandra node replacements, right? So, it will be really tricky to bake in an understanding within the operator of when it's safe and good and the correct decision to do that, right? There will be cases where it's like, if the node's literally down and then the hypervisor, the worker that it's on is marked as failed, well, it's like, yes. But there'll be a whole bunch of other, kind of questions around that. But I think explicitly, we don't want to, we're not trying to boil the ocean here. We're not trying to make this a completely serverless, self-driving kind of, capability. I already kind of covered this one, so not trying to, build a serverless facade over Cassandra. And then the other one, and this kind of came up on the mailing list discussion, was official Docker images. So one of the things we're going to have to do as, to have a Kubernetes operator is it's going to have some Docker images that it goes and runs in these pods, right? The question of having an official Docker image for the project, it kind of broadens the scope a little bit. And this is just, this is my opinion here, in that if we tried to build as well the official, Cassandra Docker image, you broaden the scope around. It's got to be aware of other control planes, right? Whether it's Docker Compose, whether that's whatever Mesos is doing, AWS ECS, just running it locally on your machine. And I think when the community decides to tackle an official Docker image, and if it gets to a point that it's nice and robust, then the Kubernetes operator can certainly adopt that, and I think that should be the direction and the path. But I think as an initial goal, trying to build an official Docker image, doesn't make a lot of sense, and it'll probably end up blocking any sort of project in that scope. So, we build a Docker image that's fit for purpose, and then once kind of this is an official better one, well then, hey, let's jump in and leverage that one. Proposed changes. Before I move on, did anyone have anything to add on the non-goals, or that all sounds pretty kosher? Okay. Sorry, I don't have the chat open. Yes, agreed. So proposed changes. So I'm just moving rooms for somewhere a bit quieter. Proposed changes. So kind of the core one here is going to be probably a new repository as a sub-project for Apache Cassandra, specifically for discussions in the mailing list around the way that we do these kind of things, especially with the DataStax announcement around drivers, where they live, that kind of thing. I mean, you know, I really don't see this living in tree, so I don't think that'll be hugely applicable to us. But it's probably just something worth paying attention to as we progress. New or changed public interfaces. There's kind of the main ones that I've kind of identified here, and again, you know, we as a team can add to this and drive that discussion as we kind of go. The main ones would be probably changing some pluggable components, like either the seed provider or the snitches or something, to have better support for Kubernetes service discovery mechanisms. I know that in our operator, we ended up modifying, I think, the simple seed provider so that you could pass in a DNS address and it would resolve all the IPs behind that DNS listing. And then it could take a subset of those IPs, so it wasn't just one IP off a single DNS resolution. So that's just one way of doing it. But whatever happens, we'll need to have probably some in-project support for service discovery. And that'll obviously need to support a change in config, maybe. And then, of course, the operator will define a custom resource description or descriptor, so a CRD, and that'll be the primary API for interacting with the operator. So that will be a public API that the Apache Cassandra project owns. I'll pause there. And any comments on that one?
Quick question on the seed provider. So things like that, and I know that one of the non-goals is an official Docker image, but things like this kind of bleed over, right? So the seed provider needs to get baked into the image. There's kind of a lot of give and take. It's not really, you know, so black and white, I guess.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's not black and white. Whether we have a pluggable seed provider that lives in the operator repository and it gets generated and added to a Docker image and baked in and part of the class path, that's one way of doing it. Or whether we
or like etcd or something like that, you know.
Yeah, right. Or we just there's a new seed provider in Cassandra, right? And then we've just got a dependency on that version, you know, having at least minimum that version. So, you know, definitely a few ways to kind of go about that. But I think for the moment, if the Kubernetes operator at least owns its own Docker image, it can be responsible for whatever needs to go into it to make it work for the moment.
So I have a question kind of on proposal, but it's kind of more like where things live on the fundamental side. Is everyone basically has their own manager. And there's an attempt right now to try to make it so that there is a centralized manager that everyone can actually work with. Is the operator planning to delegate to the manager and like have the manager interact with it as well to find these things out? Or is the operator planning to replace some of the functionalities of managers? What are your thoughts on this?
So like the lifecycle manager?
No, like there's this, sorry, everyone calls them differently. So like there's the sidecar project, for example, which is trying to be people contributing their internal sidecars into making it so they can actually manage Cassandra. So like, I'm not sure if your thinking is that the operator is its own thing that does similar, or is it delegating to the sidecars, or like what is the relationship? Is this a full-fledged project, or is it a tangent of the sidecar?
That's a really good question. I have an opinion on it, and you know, my kind of view is, I think the operator project needs to do what it needs to do in order to get off the ground and running and delivering value quickly to build velocity, right? So, for example, if someone donated their operator, whether it's Orange or DataStax or Instaclass or whoever, right, and it came with all of this, right? So it came with a sidecar, it came with a Docker image, it came with a whatever it is. My view on that would be to welcome everything with open arms, but when the other components or the other community projects reach a point where it's actually like from a maturity perspective and an involvement, we adopt those, right? Yes, that means more work. Yes, potentially it's a deduplication of different things. But I think building and working with a sense of velocity so we can start delivering, some stuff sooner rather than say having a dependency on the sidecar project, for example, that makes the most sense to me. But when it makes sense to switch, then we definitely switch. I mean, mind you, that's my opinion. I've heard other arguments where it's like, well, hey, if we do have a dependency on the sidecar, well, then you've got more people invested in improving it and fixing it and building it towards a point where it is usable, right? And having the Kubernetes operator as something that uses it would be a really good first target, right? So I think it's a really good question. I don't have the answers. I had some opinions on it, with not a ton of conviction around which one is right. But definitely something to pay attention to. Cool. And then the next section, compatibility, deprecation, migration plans. I kind of realized that this could apply to the whole, like, well, how do we do lifecycle management as defined in whatever level it is? But I kind of took it as slightly more of how does it relate to compatibility and deprecation and migration as it relates to the broader project, rather than how we go about actually implementing this stuff for the operator itself. So I've kept it kind of very, very high level from that perspective. And really just, target version 3.x. I don't think there's a ton of use targeting anything lower than that. What impact will there be on existing users? I'm saying none, because they're doing their own thing already. And then in terms of like migration, I think the main thing is just to keep in mind that we'll need to support minor and major version upgrades to Apache Cassandra and making sure that flows backwards and forwards. But again, that's more of a nod to the level 2 or capability that we talked about there. And then in terms of testing, one of the concepts that me and Patrick kind of talked about a lot was, how do we get people to buy into this and to feel comfortable that this is ready from a production perspective, and it's something that is usable and not just kind of a nice toy that's like, hey, Cassandra can do Kubernetes. And one of the ideas that we've kind of kicked around is actually building out the Apache Cassandra operator with the view of, and one of the first target use cases is actually, it can be the thing that is used to drive Cassandra for things like D-tests, right? So, looking at how do we potentially use a cluster deployed by the operator to perform D-tests on. And so that way our validation framework for Cassandra, whether it's D-test, Harry, fallout, all those bits and pieces, it is also self-verifying the operator in terms of the way it behaves, in terms of scaling nodes and adding nodes and configuration management and that kind of thing. So I think that's a potentially very promising way to drive acceptance. It also means that once we get to a point, if we do reach a nirvana where all this stuff is running and using Kubernetes and using the Kubernetes operator, or whenever there's a new release of Cassandra, we can say, well, yeah, the operator is verified for it. We ran all that testing on it. The other really great thing about it is it expands the surface area of who's working on it, right? Because it means that the broader Cassandra community is invested in making sure it behaves and it works well, because otherwise tests don't pass and they can't commit code, So that's kind of, I think, a potentially interesting approach, to getting a broader community buy-in and, a solid functional test plan. The other thing we kind of identified is whether it's worth spending some time looking at and seeing if there is like a test framework or an acceptance framework for Kubernetes operators. Like, is there a set of automated tests that, will take a CRD and
yeah, does anyone know if that exists? We were kind of stumped in that regard.
Sorry, what was the question again?
Is there like an acceptance framework for any kind of K9S Kubernetes operator typo? Yeah, like an acceptance framework for operators in general for Kubernetes, like some sort of test battery you could put against it.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, it would be cool if they did. I think it's still kind of loosey out there. Like, just are you level 3? Yes, we are. Then you're level 3. David, I would love to hear, David, your impression of using this operator in the CI/CD pipeline for Cassandra too. Sorry, Amir.
So one of the things that I'm doing, and it's kind of more hacks than anything else, but like one of the issues with Python detest, and you're calling this out a little bit, I think here, is that when everything runs local, Cassandra actually acts differently than everything is remote. So we've been doing a lot of different testing where we actually deploy the clusters and actually to hit different code paths that you cannot really hit without hacks in Python detest. So if Python detest is able to trigger a cluster in Kubernetes, doesn't, in my opinion, matter whose operator or version it is, because it's testing Cassandra itself. So it's more like, did you do this correctly? So like it does, if Netflix can use it, doesn't matter. If Apple can use it, doesn't really matter. It's more like it can give me a cluster similar to how LazyCM gives it. Then you can trigger something certain there. So I see there's benefit there. The one thing that is kind of hard, it's where are the resources? So like we have, I think, something like 9 or 12 Jenkins boxes. I don't actually remember anymore. No, wait, that was like from one. We have a decent number of Jenkins boxes, but we don't have Kubernetes boxes in ASF. So that would be the thing. It's, do independent companies run it because they have Kubernetes, or does ASF somehow get Kubernetes, or how does that relationship work? So I think that's the harder part for ASF. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Or do we run, Minikube on every box and just blow the resources out of the water completely?
Microcates.
Hey, there you go.
Microcates actually works really well. I've been talking to the canonical team.
Is that the K3?
No, Kate. That's Rancher. Microcates is from.
I mean,
canonical.
It's just an API for the day.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. And then rejected alternatives. We put Helm charts because we YAML as is.
Can we jump back up to the compatibility?
Yeah.
I just had a quick question on that. We're just targeting Apache Cassandra, right? Nothing with no DataStax distribution. Sorry, did that come through?
Oh yeah, I did. I think Ben just dropped out. They should be. Yeah, I think you're right. Like that should be something that it is. I think it should be on DataStax to make sure that whatever server version we have is compatible with it, which I don't think is going to be that hard. But yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess part of that is, and going into the extended functionality that things like DSC Graph or Solar or Spark, whatever, any of those proprietary features.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it, and then there's also different cloud implementations, etc. So probably reasonable to call that out. And it may be that you still have to use a different operator in that case. But I would hope that it is derived from this operator. I don't have a really good answer though, but I get your point. Yeah.
So
And it might be
another
just
way
in the interface.
But another way I see that, not the whole like DSC thing, but many different contributors to the project all have their own internal forks. So being able to support your own fork would actually be beneficial. So therefore, even if you have your own thing, you have your own YAML definitions, you have your own whatever, you could potentially share on this side like you do with the Apache Cassandra code base, which then means that DataStax had their own stuff. Cool. If Apple had their own stuff, cool. If Netflix has their own stuff, cool. But if everything is only in official Apache Cassandra releases, then that gets a little harder for a lot of the contributors to actually use.
I think with anything where you see a fork, you want to make sure, or a version or anything like that, you want to show some compatibility with a lot of things, like a driver, for instance. If you're not compatible with a certain driver, then what are you doing? You just created an island for yourself. So if there's like Netflix has a certain version of Cassandra that they're running with, it's up for them to make sure that it's working with the operator. But I don't think that that's a bridge too far. We're not talking about that big of a change.
Yeah, and I think like as long as folk have control over being able to specify like what Docker image the operator's deploying, like you think about like what are the various like interfaces, right? It's the Docker image itself, it's the sidecar, and then it's the CRD, right? And as long as you give folks some degree of control over that or make it extensible, I think if you are running your own fork, if you are building whatever it is on top of it, as long as you kind of got those extensibility points, then it should be pretty easy. Then from a compatibility perspective, really I think the base level is as long as you're compatible with the operator's CRD, everything else should kind of flow from that. But I'm just kind of I'm now just thinking out loud of like, how would I do it?
Yeah, and again, I think this kind of goes back to my thing about the interplay between the Docker images and the operator itself. So in my practice, or my experience anyway, having worked on operators for all the different types of databases, there's a lot of assumptions being made by operators on where things live. And so example, it's not just a simple matter of, okay, I'm gonna pull down this DataStax image and use that image instead of Apache. Well, when I do that, all of my resource files are in different locations, etc. So a simple thing like doing the config management, all of a sudden there's a whole another branch of logic that you need to worry about depending on what distribution.
Oh yeah, definitely. And that's one of the other reasons why I really didn't want to tackle an official Docker image, is because so much of those requirements around the control plane and how you interact with it just bleed through, right? So I think for the time being, the Cassandra operator project needs to own its own Docker file and Docker image.
There'll be plenty of bike shedding available. Just like defining the levels. Yeah. I'm just keeping track of the time here. I mean, I scheduled these for a paltry half hour, which is definitely not enough time. There has been someone had put on the mailing list, and I just wanted to make sure we made this point, is to combine the two meetings, because I have one that's obviously for West Coast and APAC friendly, and then one for Central European friendly. And there was somebody asked from Central Europe, which I'm like, oh, that's okay, if we could combine the meetings into one, which would mean that we run the meetings more like, that we have the meetings more around the time that we do the contributor project or the contributor meetings, which Ben probably sucks more for you. Actually, not as much since you're in New Zealand and not Australia. But this has been proposed just so that we have one conversation and not two. I just want to put it out there. Ben, I'll hear you because you're going to be the most pain on that.
Look, I'm happy to be tired and say even dumber things than usual. So that's fine.
Have you seen the timing around the contributor meeting? I think the earliest we do it, I think it's like 7 a.m. your time.
Yeah, that's fine. That's not too bad.
Yeah, not too unreasonable. It's not like 3 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wouldn't do that to you, man. All right.
Cool.
Yeah, I'll pose that to the Central European crowd tomorrow too, because they'll be later then. But yeah. So just another quick, here's a call to action this is available. It's out there. Please, this is a good time to start, adding notes, add your, what have you. I'm going to, of course, try to go in there and well, you already did, Ben, put some structure around this idea. What's a level 1, what's a level 2, level 3 in Cassandra terms? But it seems like that's what we need to be really debating right now. And, feel free to pose questions on the dev list. That's a really good place to have a conversation about things. I'll try to post a summary on there if you want to use that as a start for the thread. If you're not following dev.cassandra.apache.org, this is a great day to do it. It's a pretty light traffic list. So, but that's where a lot of substantive conversations will happen. And on the Slack as well. So there's the Cassandra Dev Slack on the ASF Slack. All right, any last minute things here?
No, I think pretty good on my side. Thanks for everyone for.
Yeah, I just want to thank you guys for putting this together and getting everyone try to collaborate. I think it's a really worthwhile effort.
Let's all start swimming together, man. Over Zoom and in a very socially acceptably 6 feet apart. All right, great, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording.